Weird and creepy disappearances are a lot more common than you'd think, and if you're familiar with the Missing 411 series made popular by David Paulides, this is something you already know. Our next case comes from Hong Kong, but rather than being a singular case revolving around a specific person, this true story is actually about a place responsible for ending the lives of people in unexplained ways, or even making them completely disappear. There's an urban legend about the northeastern peninsula of Sai Kung in Hong Kong. As with most urban legends, it varies slightly depending on who you ask. Some believe there is some kind of portal you can enter, or a barrier that can be crossed. Aliens or the spirit world are often mentioned. Others say there is simply a negative energy there, or bad feng shui. Regardless of the backstory, there is no doubt that many people have either gone missing or perished in this mysterious place, and continue to do so to this very day. Even as recently as August 2022, the time of making this video, the Sai Kung Peninsula has remained untouched by urbanisation and is mostly covered by country parks. As such, there's a huge network of hiking trails crisscrossing across the unspoilt countryside. There are, however, clear tracks and paths for everyone to follow, as well as guide stones and signs providing directions, and also special location coordinates in case of emergency. In September 2005, the South China Morning Post reported that 45-year-old off-duty constable Ting Liwa had gone missing while out hiking along the trails of Sai Kung. He had reportedly contacted emergency services an hour and a half after last being seen in a local grocery store. Constable Ting told the emergency services that he had lost his way and sounded extremely tired. They then lost contact with him. At least 100 officers and volunteers, as well as the missing constable's family, spent days searching for him. Members of the fire services and civil aid service were among the volunteers, and the government flying service even sent out a search helicopter with a thermal imaging detector to help find the missing constable. After 9 days of searching, the hunt was finally called off. Constable Ting was never seen again, and a body was never recovered. The following month, in October 2005, 22-year-old Yuan Kwok Young was taking part in a 4-day hiking course organised by the Hong Kong Award for Young People. Having been a keen Boy Scout for much of his youth, he had done a lot of hiking and was by no means an amateur. It was Sunday, October the 2nd, when he and 4 female companions were following the route set out by course instructors when he needed to stop for a rest. He told friends earlier that day that he had the flu and had taken some medicine for it, police reported. Yuan told his female companions to go on ahead and that he would catch them up. They reached the finish line without him later on that day, but Yuan never turned up. A search party was sent out to find him, involving the police, firefighters and a helicopter, searching late into the night and then again the following day. Around 100 people took part in a search on the Tuesday, 2 days after his disappearance. Given the fact that Officer Ting, who we previously discussed, had gone missing the month before, and was still missing, searchers were all the more desperate to locate the young hiker. They did finally find him, but sadly, he was no longer alive. In fact, investigators believe Yuan had been dead at least a day. They said he still had his personal belongings with him, and they didn't believe any foul play had been involved, nor did they find any suspicious circumstances. Yuan had simply just died, not far from where Officer Ting had gone missing only weeks before. Now listen, you may think this is just a coincidence, and that's fair. 2 cases aren't enough to call the place haunted, cursed, or paranormal. But the truth is, these cases are only 2 in a growing list. In January 2009, there was a case where a local bus driver, 48-year-old Wong Chak Lung, went hiking along the trails of Sai Kung on his own. He left home at around 6 AM on the 11th of January, off on a solo hike to Chung Sai Chau. The last time he was seen was when he left the bus at Pak Tam Ao at around 8:50 AM. When he failed to return home, his family raised the alarm and alerted emergency services. Once more, a team of over 100 people searched for him for days, including fire services, police, helicopter and boats, but they found no traces of the hiker and nothing to explain his disappearance. Wangchak Lung was never found. The fact is, there have been many more cases over the years where Sai Kung's trails have claimed lives or hosted mysterious disappearances. The more we looked online, the more we found. Even as recently as August of 2022, the time of writing this script, the search continues for 61-year-old hiker Jiang Qingming, who was last seen on the 27th of August 2022. With such a history, it's a wonder how people still go out hiking along these mysterious trails on their own. And there is the interesting detail. All the people that have gone missing or perished in Sai Kung were alone at the time of their disappearance. In June of 2016, there was one very lucky man who went missing for 4 days and 3 nights and actually managed to return alive. His story, if true, is an absolutely incredible one. On June the 18th, 2016, 45-year-old mountaineer Zhang Shangpeng went hiking along Sai Kung's Maklahose Trail. He took a picture of the sky and posted it on his social media at around 10 AM. Later on, he reached an area known as Dawen Mountain and suddenly lost consciousness. He woke to find himself in a bush and quite confused. He took a call from his wife and told her he would be coming home immediately. It was now the evening and the moon was out. Looking around in the dim light, his surroundings looked like they had changed. Rather than being to the side of the path where he had blacked out, he was in a completely unfamiliar area. Panic set in, and he thought he better ring the emergency services for help, but he found his phone and belongings had disappeared. Despite recently taking a call, he had no recollection of where his phone and belongings had gone, or even how much time had passed. He stumbled around for a while in the dimness of the night, and after a time he found himself in what he described as a strange valley. Tiredness overcame the lost hiker, so he sat and rested for a while, and eventually fell asleep. In the morning he woke up abruptly, and quickly got up to look around. He found himself near a pool of water, with rocks around and in it. Zhang walked past the pool and carried on for a while, when he saw a mountaineer in the distance with his back to him. Realizing that this person would be his ticket home, Zhang excitedly walked over, but before he could even speak a word, the mountaineer disappeared right before his eyes. Understandably, this gave Zhang quite a fright, and he ran off to escape the strange place he found himself in. As he was running, he saw a tourist in the distance and shouted out to them. Again, as Zhang drew near, this person also vanished, leaving the lost hiker even more shaken than before. Zhang spent the rest of the day scurrying around like a mouse stuck in a maze, trying to find a way down from the mountain. As the sun was setting, he made his way back to the rocky pool where he had slept the night before. Bizarrely, these rocks and the surrounding waters now seemed to chatter and make strange noises, like television broadcasting sounds, or a downtown area, he said. Despite the weird surroundings, Zhang was overcome by tiredness and fell asleep. He woke up just before dawn the next morning. It was now day 3, and once more he started the search for a way home. As night was turning to day, he found himself in what he described as a huge cemetery, with stone tablets neatly arranged. This made absolutely no sense. The area was a country park with no developments, nothing nearby, and no access roads. It was literally in the middle of nowhere. It was impossible, he realized. Quickly turning around, he left immediately and walked for a long while until he reached the rocky pool once more. At this point, Zhang realized he hadn't had a drink or anything to eat for days, but strangely didn't feel hungry. With the weird noises coming from the rocks once more, he curled up on the floor and fell fast asleep. Day 4, he woke up to a sunny morning with a burning determination to find his way home. He decided instead of trying to navigate down the mountain, he would go up, following a mountain stream. As he went, he reported that the rocks in the stream also made strange noises, and that as he continued up the mountain, more figures of people appeared and disappeared around him. Instead of panicking, he just defiantly pushed on. Eventually, Zhang came to a reservoir and noted that the scene seemed to have changed significantly compared to where he had just come from. He then saw some tourists and cautiously made his way over to them, fearing they too might disappear. To his surprise and delight, they were real people. Overcome by emotion, he cried with happiness and relief. Borrowing a mobile phone, he called the police and his family to let them know he was safe, and then continued along the Maclehose Trail, the route he was following days before. After 4 days and 3 nights, he was formally rescued by a friend and a rescue team who met him on the trail. Following a short stay in hospital, he wrote his account in a 3,000-word social media post telling his bizarre story. Critics were quick to suggest he had probably suffered from heat stroke or exhaustion and had simply hallucinated all the creepy things he had experienced. But many people, especially those familiar with Sai Kung and its reputation, believe Zhang's account. Whether it's actually to do with aliens, the spirit world, or some kind of strange dimension barrier, it's difficult to say and hard to prove. But one thing is for certain, Sai Kung is a place where many people have either died in unexplained ways, for no apparent reason, or have just completely vanished forever, and continue to do so. Mysterious disappearances seem to be an increasingly common occurrence these days. Is something happening to cause this increase, or have we as a species just become better connected and more informed over the past few decades? Has this been going on throughout all of human history? Many of the more recent cases have been well publicised, especially those taking place in the USA, but these mysterious disappearances are happening all over the world. The video we did covering the Sai Kung Peninsula in Hong Kong is a good example of this. In this episode, we're covering a couple of strange cases much closer to home, here in the UK. Large areas of the Scottish Highlands, found in the northern region of the United Kingdom, are a lot like many of the national parks in the USA. The Highlands are home to vast areas of natural beauty, covered in grasslands, woodlands, mountains, and of course their many lakes, or lochs as they're known. The most famous of which is Loch Ness, home to the legend of the Loch Ness Monster. But the 2 cases we're covering today don't involve Loch Ness, nor do they involve any monsters, that we know of at least. Although completely unrelated, both disappearances took place in the Scottish Highlands in the spring of 2022. These unusual cases involve a professional outdoorsman, probably more high profile and well known, since they're also a YouTuber, while the other case, the less well known disappearance, is arguably the more unusual of the 2. Listen in, and you can decide for yourself. Finn Creaney, a 32-year-old YouTuber and survival instructor, went missing on March 25th, 2022, while hiking in the Scottish Highlands. A family member had dropped him off at the beginning of his route near the Altnahara Caravan Club by Loch Neva on the B873 road that runs alongside it. Starting off on a Friday afternoon, his planned route was to walk around the loch and then head southeast to Golspie where he'd left his car, promising his wife he would return home on Sunday afternoon. Finn was an experienced outdoorsman and he had a YouTube channel where he shared his bushcraft skills and adventures. He had a passion for nature and wildlife and often went out on solo trips in remote areas. Needless to say, Finn was not a rookie, and this was not his first rodeo. After failing to return home on Sunday, as he said he would, the following day his wife Lucy reported him missing to the police. She felt silly because Finn had been on similar trips countless times before, and he was such a capable outdoorsman. That being said, he was a man of his word, and not returning when he promised he would was very uncharacteristic. A massive search operation was launched involving local officers, air support, mountain rescue, drones and volunteers. The search covered a large area between Altnahara and Golspie, where Finn was believed to have walked. However, despite the extensive efforts, no trace of the missing hiker was found, not a single thread of evidence. Finn Creaney was a local lad, and his vanishing baffled both the authorities and the public alike. How could a fit, healthy and skilled survivalist vanish without a clue in the kind of landscape he knew so well? Even to this very day, over a year later, search efforts are continued by family, friends, and other volunteers, trying to make sense of his unusual disappearance and to get some kind of closure. Hundreds of man-hours and thousands of square miles covered, and still this case is as mysterious as ever. Finn had left his wife a voicemail saying that he loved her and was very proud of her at 12:52 p.m. on the day that he went missing. Phone records show his signal cut off the following hour at 1:47 p.m, indicating that he may have turned it off, and the final confirmed sighting of Finn was at approximately 2:15 p.m, when he was dropped off at the start of his route. Some people have speculated, like in many cases of these strange disappearances, that he vanished on purpose to start a new life, that he turned his phone off because he didn't want to be tracked. But this is highly improbable. He and his wife were very happy together. They had got married the previous year, and they had a 4-year-old daughter. They had also recently found out they were going to be parents of a baby boy, something the doting father had always wanted. Finn's business was picking up too, and he was getting more classes booked for his survival school. Everything was on the up and up. This is not a man that wanted to disappear. What could have happened to him during his hike? Was he injured, lost, abducted, or worse? Did he encounter any foul play or danger from other people or creatures? His wife Lucy told local newspaper, the Inverness Courier, "It's like he literally vanished. It's almost like he has been sucked into a vortex." This is definitely something that's quite often stated in these strange missing persons cases. But what else can you say about someone who disappears off the face of the earth without leaving a single trace? In May of the same year, Neil Skinner, a 72-year-old hiker from Doncaster, vanished in the southern region of the Scottish Highlands near Loch Dochard in Argyll and Bute. Neil's family and friends are still desperately seeking answers about his fate and are hoping for a miracle over a year after he was last seen. Although Neil wasn't a survivalist or YouTuber, he was an experienced hiker who loved adventure and the outdoors and had visited many places in the UK and abroad. He also had the benefit that he was not alone when he first set out on his journey. It was on the 8th of May 2022 that he and 2 friends embarked on a trip to go hiking in the Highlands of Scotland, something he had done several times before. They started by parking their car at Victoria Bridge car park and then walked about 6 miles to Loch Dochard, where they set up camp for the night on a peninsula that jutted out into the water. The following day, the plan was to continue on to Loch Etive, a hike of about 11 miles west of their location. After approximately 90 minutes, Neil felt tired and decided against pushing on to Loch Etive, but he encouraged his companions to continue and said that he would head back to their prior site at Loch Dochard, set up camp, and await their return. This was day 2 of their excursion, of which they allowed 5 days total. Although the 2 friends who went on without Neil weren't expected to return for a couple of days, they turned back early after encountering bad weather. When they returned the following day, which would have been day 3 of their excursion, they arrived to find Neil's tent perfectly set up and his breakfast oats ready, but Neil himself was noticeably absent from his campsite. Even more strangely, all of his belongings were there in his tent, including his phone, wallet, keys, and clothes. His trusty hiking poles lay redundant on the floor. His waterproof clothing was also left behind, which seems strange since the media reports that the weather had supposedly taken a turn for the worse, which usually means rain. His friends looked around for him, but Neil was nowhere to be found, so eventually they alerted the police, who launched an extensive search operation involving helicopters, sniffer dogs, divers, and mountain rescue teams. But despite scouring the land and water for days, they found no trace of Neil or any clues to his whereabouts or what might have happened to him. And this is still the case today. The fact that Neil's camp was set up ready with his breakfast and all his gear left behind, was reminiscent of the Flannan Isles lighthouse mystery that we previously covered. Hopefully his family will get some form of closure, rather than this strange disappearance remaining a mystery forever. Finn Creaney and Neil Skinner. Were these two unfortunate souls victims of nature and the elements, or were they victims of something else? How is it possible that despite numerous large-scale professional attempts at finding out more information, as well as continued efforts by friends, family and volunteers, we have zero new information, and these two cases remain as mysterious as ever? August 23, 2010. Police break into a British Security Services apartment in Pimlico, London. Their search of the premises brings them to the bathroom, where they discover a red zipped-up and padlocked sports bag in the bathtub. Inside the bag were the keys to the padlock and the nude remains of 31-year-old MI6 codebreaker Gareth Williams, who had been missing for over a week, which is something that had strangely gone unreported by his colleagues. Gareth's fingerprints were nowhere to be found on the padlock or around the bath, and toxicology reports came back inconclusive. While it seemed like it was an obvious case of homicide, police struggled to find enough solid evidence to close the case, and an inquest was eventually opened. The 2012 inquest concluded with the coroner saying that the ending of Gareth's life was unnatural and likely to have been criminally mediated. Thanks to this unsettling conclusion, there was a follow-up re-investigation which lasted another 12 months. This investigation, carried out by the Metropolitan Police, came to a new conclusion which many found hard to fathom. Their findings were that the incident was probably an accident that came about after an S&M act went wrong. This theory developed after it was revealed that Gareth had a wig and an estimated £20,000 worth of women's clothes in his apartment. His internet search history showed infrequent visits to claustrophilia-themed websites, and a semen stain was found on the bathroom floor. It was also reported that he had once handcuffed himself to a bed and needed to be released by his landlord after he couldn't free himself.
He'd visited gay bars and bought tickets to drag shows. Police have revealed new details about the intensely private life of MI6 spy Gareth Williams, who was found dead in his London flat in August. Officers leading the investigation said that they hoped the information would help explain what happened to Mr. Williams.
Further information leaked to the press implied that he may have been gay and possibly a cross-dresser. The coroner, Gareth's family, and several experts condemned the information leaks about his personal life and said they were clear acts of media manipulation and misdirection. Is it possible that this information was purposefully leaked to make the sex game gone wrong explanation for his bizarre death more believable? It wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened. In 1994, the press reported that British MP Stephen Milligan was found deceased in a, let's say, compromising scenario that brought his character into question. What was not reported at the time was the fact that Mr. Milligan had recently either discovered or been involved in a huge cover-up of illegal arms dealing. It was revealed that an escapologist had tried around 300 times to lock himself in a bag the same way Gareth supposedly did, but failed to do so. Perhaps even Harry Houdini couldn't have performed such a trick. Even then, the police still did not rule out that Gareth had died by accident after getting into the bag on his own. His sister Kerry, who was very close to her brother, insisted Gareth was a very meticulous man, always planning things thoroughly and assessing the risks. And of course, he also had the training from his former employers at GCHQ and MI6. Does this really sound like a man who would accidentally end his life in such a way, even if he did manage to impossibly secure himself in the bag? But let's just say he did manage to lock himself inside, for argument's sake. Could he really have gotten in there and locked the bag on his own, without leaving any trace? Peter Faulding, a forensics expert involved in the case, said there were no traces of forensic evidence from Gareth in and around the bath, on the lock, bag or zipper. Simply cramming himself into the bag, naked, would have been quite difficult, and it would have been impossible not to leave fingerprints, sweat, and other traces everywhere. The coroner described the lack of hand and footprints in the bathroom as significant. When his body was eventually found, Gareth had been dead for about a week. There were no signs of a struggle, which some think shows he had been sedated or drugged. Others still say he got into the bag of his own free will. Strangely, the heating had been turned up, even though it was August, the height of British summertime. It's been noted by experts that increasing the ambient temperature accelerates the decomposition of bodies, making it difficult, even impossible, to employ many of the techniques forensic investigators use. During the initial investigation, police had been keen to speak to a man and a woman of Mediterranean appearance who had supposedly gained access to the communal hallway and may have had a key to the apartment. The police later reported that the couple had nothing to do with the incident, but we couldn't find any more information about how investigators came to that conclusion. Because of Gareth Williams' work in the shady world of espionage, several theories emerged. Some claimed that he might have been taken out by foreign intelligence agents, Russian Secret Service hitmen, or other dangerous criminal organizations. It certainly looked like a neat job done by professionals. This theory was reinforced after an inquest revealed that Gareth had performed multiple unauthorized searches of the MI6 database, which may have put him in danger to what was described as hostile and malign parties. The intelligence officer who revealed this information from behind a screen obscuring their identity did not reveal any details of Gareth's unauthorized searches. They did accept that theoretically this kind of unauthorized activity could very well have put Gareth at risk if such a dangerous third-party group or individuals had known, while MI6 remained unaware. However, the officer also added that there was no evidence to suggest that this was the case, and insisted that no link between Gareth's work and his death had been established. Further intriguing developments emerged in September and October of 2015, when a former KGB agent named Boris Kopychkov, who had defected from Russia, said during an interview that he had been informed via sources in Russia that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, otherwise known as the SVR, were responsible for bringing about Gareth's demise through the use of an untraceable poison, which was administered through his ear. The former KGB agent went on to say that the SVR had failed in attempts to blackmail Gareth into becoming a double agent. Gareth apparently responded to the SVR's attempts by informing them that he was aware of the identity of a Russian spy inside the GCHQ. This story may explain the unauthorized searches mentioned earlier. But if it is true, why didn't Gareth reveal this information to his superiors? Did the Russians really have something they could blackmail him with? The former KGB agent claimed that the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service saw Gareth as a threat, and that the SVR had no alternative but to exterminate him in order to protect their agent inside GCHQ. This footage apparently shows Gareth's last known movements, or so we're led to believe anyway. An article on Comparatech.com stated that London has 127,373 CCTV cameras, which is equal to nearly 14 cameras per 1,000 people, making it one of the most surveilled cities in the world. Isn't it a bit odd that in a city full of video surveillance, there was no footage from in and around an MI6 safe building a few minutes' walk from their headquarters? MI6 are responsible for some of the highest levels of security in the country. Gareth hadn't turned up to work all week, yet no protocols for absent staff were followed. It was actually Gareth's sister Kerry that raised the alarm when she called up at 11:30 AM on the 23rd of August. MI6 then took 5 hours to call 999 and report Gareth missing to the police, who were given the address to go and check on him, and the rest is history. Why do you suppose they waited 5 hours to call the emergency services? Why call 999 like an ordinary member of the public? Surely they have a direct number for the police. And why would MI6 not send their own people to check on Gareth? The apartment was only 5 minutes walk away. In February 2021, the now retired Detective Chief Superintendent Hamish Campbell, who oversaw the original case, made calls for a fresh forensic review. It turns out there were in fact fragments of DNA belonging to 2 separate people, that were recovered from the padlock and from the bag handle back in 2010. There was also DNA from an unknown person found on a towel elsewhere in the apartment. Almost 11 years had passed since Gareth was found, and advances in forensic science could shed new light on the mystery of the spy in the bag. Later that year, in the June of 2021, the Metropolitan Police confirmed they would be launching a forensic review. Could such a review lead to a breakthrough and finally reveal the truth behind this enigmatic death? Is it possible that even perfect crimes have perfect flaws? Or will this remain one of Britain's biggest unsolved mysteries? Imagine a town where people are just going about their daily business, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, as if hit by some kind of magical spell, some people start falling asleep, or acting drowsy and almost zombie-like, in a stupor, sometimes hallucinating or babbling nonsense, only to snap out of it hours or days later. This is exactly what started happening in a small region of northern Kazakhstan in 2013. A mysterious sleep-inducing condition spontaneously descended upon the village of Kalachi and the neighbouring mining town of Krasnogorsk, beginning in the spring of 2013. It was the month of March when the bizarre phenomena started, and went on to afflict more than 140 people, around 17% of the local population. Men, women, and children were struck equally, with no apparent explanation as to why or how this was happening. Residents would suddenly fall asleep, regardless of where they were or what they were doing. Numerous people suffered more than once from the worrying condition, some of which slept for almost a week in one stretch. Upon waking, they would suffer from headaches, amnesia, dopiness, and a general feeling of weakness. The tabloid newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda conducted an investigation and described how the mysterious condition was affecting one of the victims, reporting that the patient seems to be conscious, he can even walk, and then he still falls into a deep sleep while snoring, and when he is awakened, the person doesn't remember anything. A bad batch of vodka was first suspected for causing the illness, possibly caused by a fault at a factory, or from moonshine or homebrewed alcohol, but this theory was soon proved to be false. Adults at work or in the streets, children at school, no one was safe from the mystery illness that seemed to strike at random. As well as the aforementioned symptoms, people were also reporting hallucinations, some of which were strange and frightening. The Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper report also mentioned the experience of two young boys who had vivid hallucinations. Misha Plyukin, one of the youngsters, said that they saw light bulbs and horses flying around their room, as well as snakes slithering in their beds and worms eating their hands. Misha also said his mother appeared to have 8 eyes and even grew a trunk. The other young child, Rudolf Boyarinos, had no memory after the event, but at the time he had to be held down by 4 people and was shouting out about monsters. The terrifying sleeping sickness affected local animals too, with one newspaper reporting that a local cat owner had observed her pet throwing himself at walls and jumping around the house like crazy, meowing a lot and then falling asleep. He slept all day long, not reacting to anything, and to quote his owner, Elena, snored like a man until dinner. Investigations were launched by numerous groups and involved the likes of chemists, nuclear scientists, doctors, and epidemiologists. Food and drink from local shops were taken for testing. Samples of soil, air, and water were taken. Victims had hair, blood, and even nail samples taken for testing. As such, disease and parasitic infections, such as trypanosomiasis, commonly referred to as sleeping sickness, were ruled out by these biological screenings. Frustratingly, nothing conclusive came from any of the investigations. Many people suspected that the issue had something to do with an old uranium mine nearby, which was in operation during Soviet times. The Health Ministry of Kazakhstan tested many local homes for traces of radiation and other telltale signs of exposure, but found nothing of significance. Slightly higher levels of radon were found in a few properties, but nothing that concerned officials or would explain the sleeping sickness and how it seemed to target random people. It's this random nature of the illness that makes it all the more perplexing. If it was radiation, then why should it affect her husband, but not the wife, who lives in the same house? There are several conspiracy theories surrounding the phenomena, one of them being that the locals were being poisoned on purpose in order to move them on, so the land could be claimed for development, or for the natural resources hidden beneath its foundations. Others seem to believe it has something to do with secret weapons testing, or even extraterrestrials. It's claimed that the location of the victims appears to be in straight lines, as if some kind of beam was blasted in a single direction. However, no clear evidence has been brought forward to substantiate this claim. The official explanation that has been reached seems questionable also. This explanation, which you'll find in a lot of the media, is that the illness was indeed caused by the old uranium mines. It's believed that concentrations of carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons built up there and leaked out into the nearby area. This build-up and associated drop in oxygen levels is what has been blamed for the sleeping sickness and all its disturbing side effects. There's a few problems with this explanation. The first is, how could levels of carbon monoxide be so high out in the open air and remain concentrated long enough to cause people to become affected? Why would it affect some people but not others, even those in the same location at the same time? And finally, it's quite well known how dangerous carbon monoxide poisoning is and how lethal it can be. How come nobody has died from this? Strong men, young children, and even small animals such as cats have been affected, all seemingly in the same way. Surely the dose needed for a man to become drowsy would be lethal to a small animal. Byron Krape of Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan has a newer theory. He and a group of scientists from the university conducted a thorough long-term study, taking into account all the other findings and theories. Upon further investigation, they discovered one common fact. Many of the villagers drank water from a single source that was pumped from out of the ground. They concluded that the underground water supply must have had unknown chemicals leaked into it. They said that chemical waste was often disposed of in metal barrels back in the Soviet era. They hypothesized that one of the old mines had been used to dump such barrels, which must have corroded and slowly poisoned the underground water supply. Unfortunately, this theory still doesn't account for the fact that members of the same households did not suffer equally from the sleeping sickness, with some people not being affected at all, despite drinking the same water. Since it's been years since the last case, the only way to help solidify this poisoned water hypothesis is to venture into the old mines, which is impossible at present, since they're too dangerous to enter. There are plans to develop a drone or some kind of unmanned vehicle to enter the mines and search for evidence, which ultimately may or may not help shed light on this strange and unexplained mystery. The great outdoors is a pleasure for many, so imagine yourself descending down a picturesque mountainside and along a beautiful river over the course of several days. Doing so, however, after witnessing all of your companions lose their lives under bizarre and horrific circumstances. Just you, the wilderness, and the haunting memories stuck on replay. This is the story of Valentina Valia Utachenko, a 17-year-old hiker who survived an unexplained phenomena that was as terrifying as it was mysterious. It all started on the 2nd of August 1993, when a group of 7 hikers aged from 15 to 41 made their way through part of the Kamar-Daban, a Russian mountain range in southern Siberia, perched just below the southern tip of Lake Baikal. The group was led by 41-year-old Ludmila Korovina, an experienced hiking instructor and survivalist. Her team consisted of 23-year-old Alexander Krysin, who went by the nickname Sasha, 24-year-old Tatyana Filipenko, 19-year-old Denis Svachkin, 17-year-old Valentina Valia Utachenko, 16-year-old Victoria Zalazova, and 15-year-old Timur Bapanov. Ludmila was a hardened survival and wilderness enthusiast and instructor who had a reputation for being pretty tough. The youths admired her, and they meant a lot to Ludmilla too, especially 23-year-old Sasha, who she had known since he was a young boy. It's reported that Ludmilla had been training the young hikers for months prior to their trip, so the group began their journey well prepared, in the best possible way, and with clear skies forecast for the duration of their adventure. Despite the positive outlook, 2 days after the group set off, and about 70 kilometers into their route, things began to take a turn for the worse. The clear weather forecast proved to be wrong, and the hikers were hit by a fierce and unexpected storm while up on a particularly exposed and barren part of the mountainside. In a decision that has been described as idiotic, out of character, and even downright weird, Ludmilla decided to hastily set up camp right there on that exposed mountainside, rather than a short hike down the mountain to the dense woodland below, which would have provided excellent shelter from the elements. It's also been pointed out that a designated resting spot, complete with firewood, also lay just 30 minutes hike further up the mountain. Due to weather conditions, they were not able to get a fire going that night, but they all remained positive and rode out the worst of the storm. It's unclear exactly what happened between the previous night and the group starting their descent down the mountain the following morning, but in a written statement for the authorities, 17-year-old Valentina revealed that 23-year-old Sasha had complained of being wet and freezing, and this had prompted the group's hasty departure. Within minutes of leaving, Sasha, the young man Ludmilla had known since he was a child, had begun stumbling about and then suddenly collapsed. His mouth was foaming and he was bleeding from the nose. Ludmilla rushed over and held him as he lay. His eyes were wide. She felt for a pulse, but there was none. Their leader then instructed Valentina to take Victoria, the youngest girl, with her, and this is when all hell really started to break loose. Victoria suddenly bit Valentina as she tried to guide her down the path. The group's leader herself began feeling unwell and called for help from the others. She then started foaming at the mouth too, accompanied by bleeding from the nose. Soon she was slumped over the body of 23-year-old Sasha, succumbing to the same fate. It looked to Valentina like a strange sickness or hysteria was sweeping through the group. While all this was going on, as if struck by madness, Tatiana reportedly ran off towards some rocks and frantically started smashing her head against them. She too was foaming at the mouth and bleeding from the nose. Dennis had run off behind some stones and had climbed into his sleeping bag, also succumbing to the terrifying sickness. It's unclear what exactly happened to the two youngest of the group, 16-year-old Victoria and 15-year-old Timur, but it's understood that they met the same horrendous fate as the others. The reason why it's unclear is because Valentina didn't explicitly state what happened to them in the official written report she gave after her rescue. In this report, she mentions she tried to raise Timur, implying that he too had fallen victim. But Victoria was not mentioned at all after the biting incident. It's important to note that this entire story so far is based on Valentina's explanation of events. Other retellings of this story have included extra details, such as the victims clutching at their throats and bleeding from their eyes and ears, and other such symptoms and effects, but we couldn't find any official statements or other evidence to support this, so we didn't include it here. Feel free to correct us in the comments if you know otherwise. Back to Valentina's story. So after witnessing the shocking scenes of her fallen comrades unfold, she began to run down the mountain, perhaps wondering when it would be her turn. After a while, she stopped to catch her breath and waited, but the symptoms never came. Valentina set up shelter right there where she rested and fell asleep exhausted, her mind in total disarray. When she woke up, the plucky young lady realized that she had no other choice but to return to the location of her friends to retrieve their supplies and a map in order to survive. Retracing her steps up the mountainside, she reached the site and saw her friends again, all lying still, in the same places they had fallen the day before. She took the supplies and decided to head for the closest river. Over the course of the next few days, Valentina used the map and followed power lines, stopping to rest whenever she needed, until she got to the banks of the Snezhnaya River, where she was eventually spotted by some people boating on its waters. Alexander Kvitnitsky, one of the boatmen, said his heart sinks whenever he remembers that picture. A girl is standing on the shore, screaming, waving her hands, yes, so desperately that we immediately realized trouble. When we got ashore, she rushed to one of our participants and sobbed for a long time in her chest. Other than having a cold fever, and obviously being fairly shook up, Valentina was alive and well. She explained what had happened, and was given food and medicine by her rescuers before being taken to the authorities in the nearby town of Sludjanka on the 9th of August. For reasons undisclosed, a search party was not sent out to recover the bodies until the 24th of August, 15 days after Valentina was rescued. When they did eventually find the poor hikers, it was just as Valentina had described, like a scene from a horror movie had unfolded. Yuri Golias, one of the rescuers, told the popular newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, "It was a terrible picture. The guys were lying on a small ledge, someone pressed against each other, someone a little further away. There are no eyes. We packed the bodies in plastic bags. When we flew to Ulanud, the smell in the helicopter was impossible." The official report was released, stating that the autopsies showed that all the hikers had died from hypothermia. Pathologists also noted that each of the hikers had suffered from pulmonary edema and changes in the heart, liver, and lungs, characteristic of protein degeneration. To some natives of the area, those who believe folk stories and local tradition, it was obvious what had happened to the hikers. Apparently the group had all been collecting large amounts of goldenroot, a plant used for its stamina and endurance-enhancing properties. The belief is that they intended to sell it for profit, instead of only taking enough for their own needs. To the local folk, clearly the mountain had punished the hikers for their greed, and they ended up paying with their lives. A novel and interesting explanation, but not a favourite among the scientifically minded. One often touted theory, seemingly grounded in science, is that the illness was caused by exposure to toxic water originating from Lake Baikal, but surely this would have affected everyone, including Valentina, if it had rained down on them after precipitating or had somehow gotten into their water supplies. That being said, further reading on the subject of Lake Baikal actually proved that rather than being a dangerous and toxic threat to mankind, as some would have you believe, the lake is actually a beautiful natural wonder, teeming with plant and animal life, and home to thousands of species. Another theory to explain the incident is an outbreak of rabies, and given that Victoria suddenly bit Valentina for no apparent reason, and also the fact that stricken group members were foaming at the mouth, you can see why people might think rabies was to blame. It does, however, seem highly unlikely that so many of the group had caught rabies in the first place, and then started presenting the symptoms all around the same time. Rabies is also something that would presumably have been evident in the post-mortem investigations. Some other theories discussed online suggested that the hikers may have seen something they shouldn't have. Perhaps due to the sudden weather change, the group had to take a different route than usual, and maybe they stumbled into the military or some other government agency up to something nefarious, and then were taken care of. The main problem here is, why would they have silenced everyone but left Valentina alive? And surely with a huge amount of military and government land to work with, let alone the vast emptiness of the Siberian wilderness, why would they choose to operate in an area popular with hiking enthusiasts and tourists? This leads us to the next theory. The military or government agency involved wanted people around to test a new weapon on, a device using something like pulsed energy, infrasound, ultra-high frequencies and the like. Perhaps something similar but more deadly than what was used in the more recent Havana syndrome cases, but this still doesn't explain how Valentina would remain unaffected. Another military-related theory suggested the incident could be linked to the potent and deadly Novichok group of nerve agents. On record, these nerve agents were developed by Russia up until 1993, the same year that this tragic incident took place. Is it possible that the area the group set up camp had been exposed to one of these nerve agents, or that the storm had washed it or blown it over from more remote areas? Death from heart failure or suffocation is the usual end for a Novichok victim. The suffocation side of things is caused by the lungs filling up with fluid. Sounds a lot like pulmonary edema, no? Could this be what caused the foaming of the mouth and the bruised lungs shown in the autopsy? Could suspected nerve agent exposure be the reason why the authorities waited so long to send out a search party? But again, why would tests be conducted in a well-known hiking spot rather than more remote locations? Unless it was purposeful. This still raises the same question though. How did Valentina survive? How is it possible that she could have avoided exposure to such a nerve agent? After the fallout of the incident, Valentina seemed to just disappear for many years. Was she just hiding from the press and all the attention? Some people think she was hiding from the truth. A reporter from the newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda eventually caught up with Valentina 25 years after the tragedy. She was now married with children and revealed to the reporter that her husband had only recently found out about her terrifying experience as a youth. The 2018 interview was the first time she had openly discussed the event for many years, not wanting to relive the nightmare. In the interview, she defended the group's leader, Ludmila, who was scapegoated for the death of the youths at the time. Valentina also explained that she thought the only reason she survived was because of her strength and fitness due to her tough upbringing. When asked why the others had died, she basically restated the official narrative. One detail from this interview we found particularly intriguing was her account of what happened to Dennis. When asked how she managed to escape, she told the reporter that she credits Dennis with saving her life, and told her that he kicked her and told her to go down the mountain. But if you remember, in her official written report back in 1993, she said that Dennis had simply run off and crawled into his sleeping bag. This little fact can only add fuel to speculation that Valentina was somehow involved in the other hikers' deaths, or at least that she knows more than she's letting on. Whether there's any truth to this is hard to prove either way, and it's unlikely there will ever be a thorough reinvestigation of this tragic and pretty unusual unsolved mystery. Spontaneous human combustion, or SHC, is a term that describes the mysterious phenomenon of a person spontaneously catching on fire and burning from the inside out without any apparent explanation. The fire seems to frequently, but not always, be confined to the body, causing unusually little or even no damage to the person's surroundings. The fire consumes the majority of the body, but can leave small portions behind, such as the lower legs and feet, which I'm sure you'll agree would certainly add to the shock value for the poor individual who discovers the aftermath. SHC has been reported for centuries, with some of the earliest accounts dating back to the 15th century. It's believed the earliest case recorded happened to a knight named Polonus Vorstius in Milan, Italy, around the year 1470. According to this account, the Italian knight was at home drinking copious amounts of strong wine when he suddenly started vomiting or belching out fire, before bursting into flames in front of his horrified parents. This first account is recorded in a volume of Historiarum Anatomicarum Rarorium, written by Danish physician Thomas Bartholin in the 1650s. The collection of books details all sorts of weird and strange sciencey things and anatomical phenomena. A man vomiting flames may or may not be such a possible thing. Many claim that such an account is merely a work of fiction. Indeed, spontaneous human combustion has found its way into works of fiction by authors such as Charles Dickens, Herman Melville, and Nikolai Gogol, who have all used it as a dramatic device to kill off their characters. Dickens, in particular, defended his use of spontaneous human combustion in his novel Bleak House, where he wrote about the death of Mr. Crook, a mean old junk dealer who bursts into flames in his shop. After criticism from a scientifically minded friend, Dickens cited several real-life cases and medical opinions to support his claim that SHC was a genuine phenomena, and some of these real-life citations even ended up in the book. And Dickens was quite right to defend his belief in SHC. The term spontaneous human combustion was actually coined in 1746 by Paul Rowley, a member, or fellow as they're known, of the Royal Society of London, a highly prestigious group of scientists and intellectuals whose ranks have included the likes of Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and Albert Einstein, to name but a few. Mr. Rowley was discussing the mysterious death of Countess Cornelia Zangari-Bandi in an article for the Scientific Journal published by the Royal Society of London when he coined the term spontaneous human combustion. The 1731 death had been a high-profile and mysterious case whereby the Countess, after going to bed seemingly fine the night before, was found the next morning 4 feet from her bed, the majority of her a mere pile of ashes. Both her feet and legs from below the knee were unscathed and still in stockings. 3 fingers were also left behind, and a portion of her skull, and that was all. The bed and the rest of the furniture close by showed no signs of fire, but everything in the room seemed to be covered by a fine coating of soot, which had obviously settled once the Countess had stopped burning. Another popular case from around the same period took place in 1725 in the town of Reims in the northeast of France. A local innkeeper was awoken one night by the smell of smoke and discovered that his wife, Nicole, had been reduced to ashes in the next room. All that remained of the innkeeper's wife was her skull, a few vertebrae from her back, and her lower legs. Wooden items found nearby were undamaged, and conflicting reports state that she was found on a bed of hay that had remained untouched, while other reports state that the ground beneath her was charred. Her husband was charged with murder and initially found guilty, but he was eventually acquitted after an appeal, and her death was ruled an act of God. In his 1995 book, Ablaze: The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion, author Larry Arnold reveals that there have been hundreds of cases of SHC in the last few hundred years, and many of them are a lot more recent than the 18th and 19th centuries. On the 28th of March 1970, a shocking discovery was made in a house on Prussia Street in Dublin, Ireland. The remains of Margaret Hogan, an 89-year-old widow, were found in an armchair, amounting to not much more than ashes. But like many other cases, her feet and lower legs were left intact. The rest of the room was mostly unscathed, except for some plastic flowers that had melted on a nearby table, and strangely, her television screen had melted, despite being 12 feet away. The day before, a neighbour had witnessed a small coal fire burning in her fireplace, but investigators state that there was no evidence found that it had anything to do with the fatal blaze. A coroner's inquest the following month ruled that the cause of death was burning, but the origin of the fire remained a mystery. There are many more similar cases from the last century, but the most recent was in December 2010. The remains of 76-year-old Michael Faherty were discovered inside his home in County Galway, Ireland, and despite being located with his head near the fireplace, forensic experts found that it was not the cause of the blaze that killed Mr. Faherty. No trace of an accelerant could be found, and there was nothing to suggest foul play. The only damage was to his body, which had been totally burnt, the ceiling above him, and the floor underneath. Again, the rest of the room was unscathed. After a lengthy inquest, there was no adequate answer to what had taken place, and the incident was officially ruled as a case of spontaneous human combustion by the coroner, Dr. Kieran McLaughlin, who added he'd never seen anything like it during his 25 years in the job. So what is it that causes this bizarre phenomena? Is it something natural? Is it something paranormal? Is it an area of science we are yet to discover? These are some of the questions that have puzzled scientists, investigators, and curious minds over the last few centuries. However, there's no consensus or definitive answer to any of them. Spontaneous human combustion remains a controversial and elusive topic that defies a satisfactory explanation. One of the main challenges in studying SHC is the lack of reliable evidence and eyewitness accounts, especially with the much older cases. Skeptics claim many of these are based on hearsay, anecdotal reports, or incomplete investigations. Therefore, it's difficult to verify the details and circumstances of each case and to rule out alternative explanations. Nevertheless, several hypotheses have been proposed to try and explain how SHC could happen. Some of them are naturalistic, while others are supernatural or paranormal. The Wick effect is the most common explanation for the skeptics of SHC. The Wick effect suggests that the human body can act in a similar way to a candle, where the fat tissue under the skin serves as the wax or fuel, and the clothing or hair serves as the wick. The theory is that a small external source of ignition, such as a cigarette, a match or a spark, could ignite the clothing and start a slow and smouldering combustion that could last for hours. It's said that the body fat would melt and seep into the clothing, keeping the fire going until most of the body is consumed. Believers of this theory contend that the hands and feet, which have less fat and are further away from the centre, would be more likely to remain intact and for the fire to stay localised and self-extinguishing. The problem many have with this explanation is that it's highly unlikely that someone would just casually let themselves be on fire for hours while they slowly disintegrate. The other problem is this: the heat required to cremate a body in a crematorium is at least 1400 degrees Fahrenheit or 760 degrees Celsius. Even if it were possible for a slow-burning human candle to reach this temperature, surely the surroundings would be much more damaged, even catch the house on fire. And the truth is, crematoriums often heat up bodies as high as 1800 degrees Fahrenheit in a confined area, and people don't realise this still isn't enough to burn the bone down to ashes. The workers actually remove the bones afterwards and crush them down mechanically, and this dust is what's presented in the urn after the job is done. Knowing this, the fact that spontaneous human combustion often reduces bone down to ashes only makes the phenomena seem even more amazing. Possible biological explanations theorize that flammable methane or even acetone could build up in a victim's body, reaching critical levels, and then could be triggered by an internal force, such as mitochondria gone awry, or an external force, such as geomagnetic activity. The geomagnetic hypothesis links SHC to fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field, and suggests that changes in geomagnetic activity could interfere with the electrical impulses in the nervous system and cause them to overload and ignite the body. Geomagnetic activity can be influenced by things like solar storms, lunar phases, or seismic events. Then there's the psychic hypothesis, which involves paranormal or supernatural causes for spontaneous human combustion. It speculates that psychic phenomena, such as pyrokinesis, could be responsible for setting people on fire. Pyrokinesis is the alleged ability to create or manipulate fire with one's mind. Some proponents of this hypothesis believe that SHC could be an involuntary manifestation of pyrokinesis, triggered by emotional stress, anger, or fear. These are just a few of the possible explanations for this unusual and polarizing subject, and of course there are many more to discover. What about you, dear listener? Do you agree with any of the aforementioned hypotheses? Or do you have your own unique insight into the subject? Regardless of your beliefs, spontaneous human combustion is a fascinating topic that deserves further exploration and investigation. It challenges our understanding of the human body and its interactions with the seen and the unseen. It also reflects our fears and fantasies about death and its mysteries. Bashir Khashoggi, originally from the Middle Eastern country of Lebanon, appeared to be living the American dream, having opened a successful Moroccan-themed restaurant in Philadelphia, USA, in 1977 with his sister Vivian. Unfortunately, this American dream was to become a nightmare. In 1982, Bashir and his sister decided to open a second restaurant in northwest Washington, D.C. Shortly after installing the phone line, Bashir became the target of an insane and relentless stream of threatening phone calls. The first phone call he received that day, back in 1982, turned out to be the first of thousands he would receive over the course of 9 grueling years. At the beginning, it was just silence on the line. Then, The calls started to include disturbing sounds, and sometimes a sinister laughter. Eventually, the harassment escalated when the unknown caller started telling Bashir, "You will be killed." During these many different phone calls, there were sounds of screaming, machine gun fire, and perhaps most unsettling of all, the perpetrator began imitating the voice of a young boy, and for that reason they started referring to the caller as l'enfant, French for the child. Soon this constant chain of real terror, harassment and threats overflowed beyond just Bashir. Anyone associated with the restaurant owner became a target, and that wasn't limited just to his employees. Even his pregnant girlfriend found herself in the crosshairs. The harassment eventually caused their relationship to end. The Moroccan restaurant would receive up to 20 calls per day from the sinister stranger, and when Bashir travelled to Philadelphia to visit his sister, the calls followed him to her restaurant too. This indicated that the people responsible were probably watching his every move. What really started to make his blood run cold was when the unknown caller began mentioning the names of Bashir's old friends from Lebanon. These were people he had not seen in years. How would they have found out this information? There weren't any platforms like Facebook to give insight into people's personal lives back then. The caller started giving details that made it clear that they were really watching him. This not only added to his fear, but also showed a deeper level of obsessive dedication to ruin Bashir's life. Employees came and went, repelled by the atmosphere the constant harassment created. One employee even checked into a hospital for a month to deal with the stress and nervous tension caused by the endless chain of phone threats. The harassment first got physical when Stars of David were scratched all over Bashir's Mercedes. Then in May 1986, the harassment took an even more serious turn. While driving his car, smoke began to bellow from Bashir's engine. He pulled over and lifted the hood to see what was causing it, and through the smoke he could see flames coming from some wires. He then had the car taken to a mechanic, where he was told that the fault indicated that someone was trying to hurt him. It was clear that his vehicle had indeed been sabotaged. It was at this point where Bashir sought help from the FBI. He asked them to investigate his case and find out who was responsible for this dreadful persecution. After putting a trace on the phone, the FBI recorded more than 3,000 threatening calls over an 18-month period. The calls were coming from different payphones in the Washington metropolitan area at such a frequency that it would have been virtually impossible for only one person to be involved. The FBI concluded that L'Enfant was a plot organised by multiple people, possibly for the sole purpose of driving the restaurant owner insane, and L'Enfant almost succeeded. Bashir began to crack. He became suspicious of everyone, and his level of paranoia resulted in many sleepless nights. In the nights he did manage to sleep, he would be woken by violent nightmares. The lack of sleep caused him to suffer from extreme mood swings, which made him alienate himself from his loved ones, causing his paranoia to deepen even further. In 1987, he checked into the psychiatric ward of Sibley Memorial Hospital in Washington. He had decided to isolate himself, hoping to have a break from the constant menaces, but even while he was in the hospital, he still received calls threatening to kill him. They even mentioned details about his routine and daily movements, letting him know that they were still watching. And if that's not enough, when Bashir was in hospital, the calls continued at his DC restaurant, where Raj Tooley, an employee filling in for Bashir, became a new target for the harassment. Sadly, Tooley's young son Richard was also targeted. One day, whilst walking home from school, two men approached the young boy, asking if he was Richard. When he confirmed he was, they brutally attacked him. Later that day, the creepy child, L'Enfant, called Tooley, telling him that they were behind the attack on his son, asking him, "How was that for starters?" And even worse, the following day, they painted "Richard will die" on the front of Tooley's home. What was the reason for all this madness? Why was Bashir being targeted? Nobody knew for sure, making it harder to determine who could be responsible. However, there was something in his past that seemed to hold a possible connection. One particular element of the disturbing calls eventually triggered a case of post-traumatic stress disorder in Bashir, and that was the sounds of people screaming as if they were being beaten. You see, back in 1974, Bashir and his American wife Gail were living in Beirut, Lebanon, a region that had seen many years of social unrest and violence. On the night of July the 1st of that same year, Bashir's wife, who was a professional singer, had been performing at a party held by a Saudi princess in the Phoenicia Hotel, a location which was well known to be a meeting place for Middle Eastern diplomats and arms dealers. While en route to pick her up, Bashir was ambushed and kidnapped by armed men. Bashir was now in the hands of the PLO. He spent 5 days being deprived of sleep, interrogated, and being beaten at regular 2-hour intervals for reasons he never understood. When he told the PLO that he was a US citizen, they accused him of being in the CIA, and his experience intensified. On day 5 of his captivity, the lack of sleep began to cause him to hallucinate. He began hearing the screams of what he thought was his family. Amongst the dirt and rubble in his cell, Bashir found a jagged piece of plastic which he used to try to end his own life and escape his torment. He was found shortly after by his kidnappers, who rushed him to a hospital where doctors saved his life. Some reports we read on this story say that it was at this point where he managed to escape, whereas other accounts state that it was with the help of the hospital staff and his family that negotiations were made to secure his release. 2 months after his ordeal, Bashir returned to the United States, where his marriage eventually broke down and ended in divorce. Wherever it was that Bashir had been held in captivity, he knew he wasn't alone. From neighbouring cells, Bashir could hear the desperate screams of other people in the same dire situation he found himself in. When his story was covered by the TV show Unsolved Mysteries in 1993, he said he had started to believe that these same screams were amongst the disturbing sounds being played down the phone to him in many of the menacing calls he received. Bashir never received psychological help immediately after his kidnapping, and he felt paranoid and guilty because he thought other people must have believed he had done something wrong and considered him a political threat. Perhaps some of the same shady people who used to frequent the hotel his wife had performed at were behind the kidnapping, or maybe his loose association with the hotel made him a target in the eyes of other hostile groups. Bashir spent several years in and out of Sibley Memorial Hospital, but thankfully the harassment by l'enfant stopped following the TV appearance on Unsolved Mysteries. As a result, the FBI decided to file this unsolved case for good. No arrests were ever made. Strangely, and perhaps as a result of psychological damage, it was reported in 2002 that Bashir had started 2 anti-Semitic and homophobic websites and posted ads in the Washington Post claiming that Jews and the Israeli government were responsible for his 1974 abduction and subsequent harassment. The article goes on to state that his niece and the restaurants she was now running had distanced themselves from him, adding that they do not condone or share his opinions, making it clear that Bashir no longer had anything to do with the businesses. So what really happened? Did his kidnappers really decide to follow him all the way to the US and harass him for a decade? Another possible theory raised is that one of Bashir's abductors may have been someone that later became a diplomat or politician in Lebanon and may have moved to Washington. Perhaps then they decided to continue his torture through psychological torment, still believing he was guilty of something. Interestingly, the episode of Unsolved Mysteries that discussed Bashir's case left out some details that he had disclosed to the Los Angeles Times newspaper the year before, in 1992. For starters, it turns out that his wife Gail was not at the location she said she would be that fateful night he was kidnapped. After waiting an hour and a half till 1 AM, he left the location without her, and that's when he was attacked and abducted. As well as being a missing detail, this also conflicts slightly with what he told Unsolved Mysteries, stating it was while en route to pick her up. Although it's only a minor difference, it's an interesting one nonetheless. He also revealed in the LA Times article that when he later questioned where Gail had been that evening, her response had been vague. Had she been involved in his kidnapping? And why would Unsolved Mysteries leave these details out? Furthermore, the stars of David being scratched into his Mercedes was also left out of the episode, but was present in the LA Times article. And more bizarre still, the separate account of his car wires being tampered with and catching fire was not reported in the LA Times, but is present in the episode of Unsolved Mysteries. This leads us to question whether these were just editorial decisions, or whether Bashir's story had changed. But why? Was he more than just an innocent victim in all of this? It's hard to find any concrete evidence either way, and there are many more questions than answers in what remains a pretty strange unsolved mystery. What do you think?